It is perhaps fitting, when we begin to trace the intellectual roots of a thinker whose name has become almost synonymous with modern evolutionary biology, to pause for a moment and ask ourselves what it means to stand on the shoulders of giants. What does it mean to inherit a tradition that stretches back to the mid-19th century, when a modest naturalist in a modest English manor house first dared to suggest that the diversity of life might be explained without recourse to divine design? In the gentle cadence of this exploration, we will follow the path that led Richard Dawkins from a childhood in Nairobi, through the lecture halls of Oxford, and into the very heart of a scientific revolution that reshaped our understanding of what it means to be alive. Richard Dawkins entered the world on the 26th of March, 1941 in Nairobi, then part of British East Africa. His early years were marked by the quiet rhythms of colonial life, long evenings spent listening to the distant calls of wildlife, the occasional encounter with a zebra or a giraffe on the horizon. These formative experiences, though seemingly anecdotal, planted a seed of curiosity about the natural world that would later blossom into a lifelong fascination with the mechanisms that drive biological change. When his family returned to England after the war, young Richard found himself at a boarding school where the classics were prized, yet the sciences whispered from the margins of the curriculum. It was there that he first encountered the works of Charles Darwin, not as a distant historical figure, but as a living conversation partner whose ideas still sparked debate in the classrooms of the day. The influence of Darwin on Dawkins cannot be overstated. In his own words, Dawkins has often recalled the moment he first read On the Origin of Species as a teenager. I felt as though a great secret had been revealed to me, a secret that explained the astonishing diversity of life in a way that was both simple and profound. The elegance of natural selection, the gradual accumulation of small variations leading to the emergence of complex forms, resonated with a mind that was already attuned to the patterns of cause and effect. Yet as the 1960s unfolded, the scientific milieu in which Dawkins came of age was undergoing its own transformation, a synthesis of genetics, paleontology, and systematics that would be known as the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis, a term that evokes both the consolidation of disparate strands of biological thought and the birth of a new paradigm, was the work of a generation of scientists who sought to reconcile Mendelian genetics with Darwinian selection. Figures such as J.B.S. Haldane, Sewall Wright, and Theodosius Dobzhansky forged a framework in which genes were the fundamental units of inheritance, and populations, rather than individuals, were the primary arenas of evolutionary change. Haldane, in particular, left an indelible mark on the intellectual landscape that Dawkins would later inherit. In a 1957 essay, Haldane famously wrote, "The world is a dangerous place, not because of the evil of men, but because of the sheer number of ways in which the universe conspires against the survival of any one species." This stark, almost poetic acknowledgement of the relentless pressures of natural selection echoed in Dawkins' later reflections on the hostile environment in which genes must vie for replication. It was within this vibrant intellectual climate that a young Dawkins entered the University of Oxford in 1959, enrolling at Balliol College to study zoology. Oxford at that time was a crucible of evolutionary thought, a place where the echoes of the modern synthesis reverberated through the lecture halls and laboratories. Among the faculty, one figure stood out for his pioneering work on animal behavior. Nicolaas Tinbergen, a Dutch ethologist who had already been awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1973 for his discoveries concerning the organization and elicitation of individual and social behavior patterns in animals. Tinbergen's approach, grounded in careful observation, experimental manipulation, and an insistence on the functional significance of behavior, would become a cornerstone of Dawkins' own methodological outlook. The mentorship under Tinbergen is a story that often surfaces in recollections of Dawkins' early career, and it is worth pausing to consider the texture of that relationship. Tinbergen was not merely a supervisor. He was a guide who taught Dawkins to listen to the subtle cues of animal life, to appreciate the elegance of a bird's song as a signal shaped by evolutionary pressures. In a 1972 interview, Tinbergen recalled a particular afternoon when a young Dawkins, notebook in hand, observed a group of meadow pipits for hours, noting the precise timing of their alarm calls. "He asked me why the birds called when they did, and I told him that the answer lay in the selective advantage of early warning," Tinbergen said. Richard took that lesson and ran with it, turning the question of why into a rigorous investigation of the mechanisms that underlie behavior. This anecdote illustrates how Dawkins learned to bridge the gap between descriptive natural history and the mechanistic explanations that would later define his work. The year 1972 proved to be a pivotal moment not only for Dawkins personally, but also for the broader discourse on evolution. Oxford hosted a symposium on evolution that year, bringing together leading biologists, philosophers, and historians of science to discuss the state of evolutionary theory and its future directions. The symposium was marked by a series of spirited debates, one of which centered on the adequacy of the gene-centric view that had become increasingly dominant. At the time, Dawkins, then a freshly minted lecturer, presented a paper titled "The Gene as the Unit of Selection," arguing that the gene, rather than the organism or the group, should be considered the primary level at which natural selection operates. His presentation was met with both enthusiasm and skepticism, the latter embodied in the voice of a prominent developmental biologist who questioned whether reducing evolution to the fate of individual genes might overlook the complex interactions that give rise to phenotypic traits. It is within this context that we encounter the metaphor that would later become the centerpiece of Dawkins' most famous work. The Selfish Gene. In 1976, Dawkins published The Selfish Gene, a book that not only popularized evolutionary biology but also introduced a narrative device, a metaphorical gene that behaves as if it were a selfish agent, striving to replicate itself, often at the expense of the organism that houses it. The metaphor was deliberately provocative, designed to shift the perspective from the organism to the gene. As Dawkins himself explained in the opening chapter, we are survival machines, vehicles constructed by genes for the purpose of their own replication. The phrasing, simple yet profound, invites the listener to imagine genes as architects of biological form, each competing in an invisible arena of replication. But why did this metaphor resonate so deeply? To understand that, we must consider the intellectual climate of the 1970s, a period when the reductionist impulse in biology was gaining momentum. The gene, with its clear, quantifiable nature, offered a tidy explanatory unit, yet this very reductionism also attracted criticism. One of the earliest and most influential counterarguments came from the field of multi-level selection theory, championed by biologists such as David Sloan Wilson and Elliot Sober. They argued that selection does not operate solely at the level of genes. Rather, groups, populations, and even species can be units of selection under certain conditions. In their 1994 work, Wilson and Sober wrote, "The evolution of altruistic behavior cannot be fully explained by gene-centric models. We must consider the selective pressures that act upon groups of individuals." This perspective reintroduced a level of complexity that seemed to challenge the simplicity of the selfish gene metaphor. A second, more recent line of critique emerged from developmental systems theory, DSD, a framework that emphasizes the interplay of genetic, epigenetic, environmental, and stochastic factors in shaping development. Proponents of DSD, such as Susan Gama and Eva Jablonka, argue that the gene cannot be isolated from its developmental context. Gama, in her seminal 1985 book The Ontogeny of Information, wrote, "Genes are not the sole carriers of information. Rather, they are part of a distributed network of processes that together give rise to the phenotype." From this viewpoint, the metaphor of a selfish gene risks obscuring the collaborative nature of biological development, where genes, cellular machinery, and external cues co-act in a dynamic dance. These counterarguments do not merely serve as academic objections, they shape the way we think about evolution in everyday life. Consider, for instance, the way we understand human social behavior. If we adopt a strictly gene-centric view, we might be tempted to explain altruism, cooperation, or even cultural practices as mere byproducts of selfish genetic imperatives. Yet the multi-level selection perspective invites us to see how group norms, shared rituals, and collective identities can exert selective pressures that shape individual behavior. Similarly, developmental systems theory reminds us that the expression of a gene is contingent upon nutrition, stress, and countless other environmental variables, a reminder that the story of a gene cannot be told in isolation. To illustrate the practical implications of these debates, let us turn to two concrete examples. The first concerns the evolution of the sickle cell allele in human populations. From a gene-centric standpoint, the persistence of this allele, despite its deleterious effects when present in homozygous form, can be explained by the concept of heterozygote advantage. Individuals carrying one copy of the sickle cell gene are more resistant to malaria, granting them a selective benefit in regions where the disease is endemic. This explanation fits neatly within the selfish gene narrative, as the gene benefits by ensuring its own propagation. Yet a multi-level selection perspective adds nuance, suggesting that the prevalence of the allele is also shaped by the social and ecological context, such as population density, migration patterns, and community health practices, that influence the spread of malaria itself. The allele's fate, therefore, is not merely a story of a gene's self-interest, but also a tale of how groups and environments co-determine evolutionary outcomes. The second example lies in the realm of cultural evolution, particularly the transmission of language. Gene-centric models might argue that language is an adaptation that arose because it facilitated cooperation among individuals, thereby enhancing the reproductive success of the carriers of the underlying genetic predispositions for language acquisition. However, developmental systems theory pushes us to consider how linguistic structures are scaffolded by social interaction, learning environments, and even technological artifacts such as writing systems. As linguist and philosopher Daniel Dennett has noted, language is not a gene. It is a replicator that rides on the backs of genes, but its replication is mediated by the brain, the community, and the culture. This layered view underscores that the evolution of language cannot be reduced to a single gene, no matter how selfish it may be imagined. In weaving together these strands, historical anecdotes, scientific concepts, and philosophical reflections, we inevitably encounter the broader epistemological debates that have shaped the philosophy of science itself. Two thinkers whose ideas continue to frame our understanding of scientific progress are Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. Popper, famed for his doctrine of falsifiability, argued that scientific theories must be testable and refutable. In The Logic of Scientific Discovery, he wrote, "A theory that explains everything explains nothing." This principle resonates with Dawkins' insistence on empirical rigor. The selfish gene hypothesis, while metaphorical, makes precise predictions about gene frequency dynamics, which can be measured and, if necessary, falsified. Dawkins himself has often invoked Popperian ideas, emphasizing that his metaphors are not mere storytelling devices, but hypotheses that must withstand the scrutiny of data. Thomas Kuhn, on the other hand, introduced the notion of paradigm shifts, a radical reconfiguration of the scientific worldview that occurs when anomalies accumulate and a new framework supplants the old. In The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn described how normal science operates within a prevailing paradigm until a crisis forces a revolutionary change. The rise of the gene-centric view in the 1960s and 1970s can be seen as such a shift, moving biology away from a focus on whole organisms and populations toward the molecular mechanisms of inheritance. Yet the subsequent emergence of multi-level selection and developmental systems theory suggests that the paradigm is not static. It is undergoing a further transformation, perhaps toward a more integrative, pluralistic approach. This dynamic mirrors Kuhn's own observation that scientific revolutions are not linear progressions but complex, often contested, reconfigurations of thought. Returning to the personal narrative, it is worth recalling another anecdote that captures the spirit of the era. In the summer of 1971, a young Dawkins attended a lecture by the British biologist J.B.S. Haldane, who, with characteristic wit, proclaimed, "I would have been a physicist if I had been born a few centuries earlier." Haldane's humor masked a profound conviction that the laws governing life could be understood through the same quantitative rigor that underpinned physics. Dawkins, listening from the back row, felt a spark of recognition. He later recounted, "Haldane's confidence that biology could be as precise as physics gave me the courage to pursue a path that seemed, at the time, almost rebellious." This moment, set against the backdrop of post-war scientific optimism, illustrates how the intellectual climate of the 1960s and 1970s nurtured a generation of scientists willing to challenge entrenched ideas and to seek unifying principles across disciplines. The mentorship of Nicolaas Tinbergen, the intellectual stimulus of Haldane's lectures, and the collective energy of the 1972 Oxford Symposium all converged to shape Dawkins' perspective. Yet his work did not emerge in a vacuum. It was part of a broader dialogue that included philosophers of biology such as Ernst Mayr, who emphasized the importance of population thinking, and Michael Ruse, who explored the implications of evolutionary theory for ethics and society. Mayer's concept of species as populations of interbreeding individuals provided a counterbalance to the gene-centric focus, reminding scholars that the dynamics of whole populations could not be ignored. Ruse's engagement with the social ramifications of evolution, meanwhile, highlighted the need for careful communication, a lesson that Dawkins would take to heart in his later popular writings. In reflecting on these interwoven influences, one might ask, what does it mean to be a thinker situated at the crossroads of biology, philosophy, and public discourse? Dawkins himself has often described his role as that of a translator, of complex scientific ideas into language that can be appreciated by a broader audience. This self-identification echoes the ancient tradition of the philosopher-scientist, a figure who not only advances knowledge but also interrogates its foundations. By invoking the metaphor of the selfish gene, Dawkins sought not only to explain a biological mechanism, but also to challenge readers to reconsider the relationship between agency, purpose, and chance in the natural world. The journey from the early days in Nairobi to the lecture halls of Oxford, from the mentorship of Tinbergen to the debates at the 1972 symposium, is more than a biographical sketch. It is a window into a period of scientific history marked by bold hypotheses, rigorous testing, and an ever-present tension between reductionist clarity and holistic complexity. The gene-centric view, embodied in the selfish gene metaphor, offered a powerful lens through which to view evolution, yet it also opened the door for alternative perspectives that emphasized the importance of groups, developmental contexts, and environmental interactions. These competing frameworks continue to shape contemporary research, from the study of epigenetic inheritance to the modeling of cultural evolution. As we move forward in this exploration, let us keep in mind the words of Thomas Kuhn, who warned that the history of science is not a steady accumulation of facts, but a series of revolutions. The intellectual revolutions that Dawkins both contributed to and was shaped by remind us that scientific ideas are alive, subject to revision, and deeply intertwined with the cultural and philosophical currents of their time. In the next segment, we will examine how Dawkins' gene-centric narrative has been taken up, contested, and reinterpreted in the decades since the selfish gene first appeared on bookshelves, and how these debates continue to inform our understanding of life itself. It is a quiet evening in the mind of a thinker who has spent a lifetime tracing the invisible threads that bind living things together, and yet, in that same quiet, a spark of curiosity ignites. What if the very patterns that shape our genes also shape the ideas that flutter through our societies? Richard Dawkins, in the opening pages of The Selfish Gene, offers a single, deceptively simple word that has since rippled across disciplines, across cultures, across the very fabric of the internet itself. He calls it a meme, a unit of cultural transmission, a piece of information that replicates, mutates, and competes for the attention of minds. The term, coined in 1976, was meant to be a cultural analog to the gene, a conceptual bridge that would allow us to ask, with a calm, reflective curiosity, whether the forces that drive biological evolution might also be at work in the evolution of ideas. When Dawkins first introduced the meme, he did so with the same gentle, almost conversational cadence that characterizes his broader work. He wrote, "Just as the gene is a unit of biological information, so the meme is a unit of cultural information." In that sentence, there is a subtle invitation to consider the mind not as a sealed, private arena, but as a landscape open to the same pressures of selection that shape the bodies we inhabit. This invitation, however, raises an immediate philosophical question. If ideas are replicators, does that dissolve the classic mind-body dualism that has haunted philosophers since Descartes? Are thoughts merely patterns of information, no more distinct from the biochemical processes of neurons than a gene is distinct from the cellular machinery that houses it? To answer that, we must first understand the origin of the meme in Dawkins' own words. He writes, "The term meme was coined to give a name to the notion of a unit of cultural transmission, or a unit of imitation." He deliberately chose a word that sounded like gene to signal that the analogy was not accidental. The meme, he suggested, could be a tune, a catchphrase, a fashion, a religious belief, or any other cultural artifact that spreads from mind to mind. The metaphor was meant to be provisional, a heuristic device, a way of thinking about cultural change without committing to a fully fledged scientific theory. Yet, as the years have shown, the heuristic soon became a theory in its own right, spawning an entire field, memetics, that seeks to model cultural evolution with the same mathematical rigor once reserved for genetics. The philosophical implications of this move are profound. If we accept that ideas behave like genes, then the sharp distinction between the mental and the physical begins to blur. Information, after all, is not a substance but a pattern, and patterns can be instantiated in any medium that can support them. DNA, neural firings, silicon chips, even the collective behavior of a flock of birds. In this view, the mind is less a private theater and more a node in a vast, distributed network of information flow. This resonates with the information-theoretic perspective championed by Claude Shannon, who showed that the content of a message can be separated from the physical medium that carries it. Dawkins, perhaps unintentionally, aligned his meme concept with Shannon's abstraction, suggesting that the content of culture could be studied independently of the hardware of human brains. One might pause here and ask, does this reduction of culture to information deny the richness of human experience? Does it reduce art to a mere pattern of bits? The answer, as Dawkins himself hints, is not a denial but a reframing. He writes, the gene is a selfish replicator, but the meme is a replicator that may be selfish, altruistic, or even neutral, depending on the context in which it spreads. The meme, unlike the gene, is not bound by the constraints of a single organism's survival. It can thrive in the mind of a child, in the code of a computer, in the lyrics of a song, and it can do so without any direct benefit to the host. This opens a philosophical space where the moral valence of ideas can be examined not as a property of the ideas themselves, but as an emergent property of the networks through which they travel. To illustrate the power of this concept, let us turn to two concrete examples that have unfolded in the public sphere over the past 2 decades. The first is the slogan, God Delusion, which Dawkins himself popularized in his 2006 book of the same name. The phrase, a concise, provocative encapsulation of a broader critique of religion, spread far beyond the pages of the book. Within months, it appeared on T-shirts, in protest signs, in online forums, and even in political debates. The meme of God Delusion replicated across cultural contexts, each iteration slightly altered, sometimes softened to God Question, sometimes sharpened to Atheist Manifesto, yet the core informational payload remained recognizable. The slogan's success can be understood through the lens of memetics. It is simple, emotionally resonant, and taps into a pre-existing cultural tension about faith and reason. Its replication is facilitated by the ease with which it can be transmitted, through print, speech, and digital media, mirroring the way a gene that confers a reproductive advantage spreads through a population. The second example is more whimsical, yet no less instructive: the viral cat videos that have dominated internet culture since the early 2000s. A simple clip of a kitten chasing a laser pointer or a cat reacting dramatically to a cucumber can garner millions of views, be remixed into countless derivative works, and embed itself into the collective consciousness of a generation. The meme here is not a single video but a template, a recognizable pattern of feline behavior that invites imitation and variation. Each new video adds a twist. A cat wearing a tiny hat, a cat interacting with a robotic vacuum, a cat set to a classical music soundtrack. The underlying structure, however, remains stable enough to be instantly recognizable. In memetic terms, the cat video meme has a high fidelity of replication. The core idea is preserved, combined with a high mutation rate. The variations keep it fresh. A combination that, according to Dawkins, makes for a particularly successful replicator. Both examples illuminate how memes operate within the broader ecosystem of cultural evolution. They demonstrate that memes are not merely passive carriers of information, they are active participants in a selection process. The God Delusion slogan survived because it resonated with a demographic seeking intellectual validation for secularism, while the cat video thrived because it appealed to universal human affection for animals and the low-cost entertainment value it provided. In both cases, the replicators, words, images, sounds competed for limited cognitive resources, attention, memory, and the willingness to share. The meme that best satisfied these constraints proliferated, while others faded into obscurity. Yet the meme concept has not escaped criticism. Susan Blackmore, a prominent scholar of consciousness and memetics, offers a nuanced critique in her 1999 work, The Meme Machine. She asks, what exactly is a meme? Is it a piece of information, a pattern of behavior, or a unit of imitation? Blackmore points out that without a clear, operational definition of the replicator, the theory risks becoming a metaphor rather than a scientific framework. She argues that while the gene has a well-defined physical substrate, DNA, memes lack a comparable material anchor. In response, Dawkins has often emphasized that the lack of a physical substrate does not invalidate the concept. Rather, it invites us to broaden our understanding of what can constitute a replicator. He writes, a meme is a pattern that is transmitted from one mind to another, not a thing that exists in the world independent of minds. This reply, while philosophically elegant, leaves open the question of measurement. How do we quantify meme fitness, mutation rates, or inheritance fidelity without a tangible substrate? Daniel Dennett, in his seminal book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, extends this line of critique by cautioning against the overextension of biological metaphors into the cultural realm. He asks, are we not at risk of anthropomorphizing culture, of seeing intentional agency where there is none? Dennett suggests that while the analogy between genes and memes is useful, it can become misleading if we treat memes as if they possess agency comparable to living organisms. He writes, the danger lies not in the metaphor, but in the temptation to reify it, to turn a useful analogy into an ontological claim. This warning resonates with the broader philosophical debate about the nature of representation. Does the meme exist as an entity, or is it merely a convenient shorthand for describing patterns of cultural transmission? Richard Rorty, the American pragmatist, adds a different dimension to the critique. In Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, Rorty argues that the search for a universal, immutable structure underlying culture, whether gene, meme, or language, mirrors a metaphysical quest he deems misguided. He writes, we should stop looking for a mirror that reflects the world as it is and start looking at the vocabularies we use to talk about it. From Rorty's perspective, the meme is less a scientific object and more a linguistic tool that reflects our desire to impose order on the chaotic flow of human experience. His pragmatist stance invites us to evaluate memes not by their fidelity to an abstract model, but by their practical consequences. Do they enrich conversation? Do they foster solidarity? Do they help us navigate the complexities of modern life? These criticisms converge on two central counterarguments. The first concerns the lack of a clear, empirically verifiable definition of the meme as a replicator. Without a precise unit of analysis, the theory risks becoming a catch-all for any cultural phenomenon, losing explanatory power. The second concerns the overextension of biological metaphors, which can obscure the distinct mechanisms that govern cultural transmission. Mechanisms that involve intentionality, symbolic meaning, and power dynamics that have no direct analog in genetics. In response, contemporary memetic theorists have sought to refine the concept. Some propose a dual-level model, distinguishing between memes as abstract informational patterns and meme vehicles as the concrete carriers, books, videos, neural firings that instantiate those patterns. Others incorporate insights from network theory, treating cultural transmission as a complex adaptive system where nodes, individuals, and edges, social connections, shape the flow of information. The historical backdrop of these debates adds texture to the philosophical narrative. In the summer of 1999, a modest conference convened in a Cambridge college hall, gathering biologists, anthropologists, computer scientists, and philosophers under the banner Meme Theory and Cultural Evolution. The gathering was informal, yet electrifying. Scholars presented early computational models that attempted to simulate memes spread across social networks, long before the rise of modern social media platforms. One presenter, a young cognitive scientist named Susan Blackmore, demonstrated a simple agent-based model where virtual agents copied and mutated strings of symbols, observing emergent patterns reminiscent of real-world fads. The audience, a mix of skeptics and enthusiasts, engaged in heated discussions about whether the models captured the richness of human culture or reduced it to a sterile algorithm. A memorable anecdote from that conference involves a participant who, after a long day of presentations, quipped, "If memes are the genes of culture, then I must be a cultural mutagen, because I keep inventing new ways to misquote philosophers." The laughter that followed was not merely comic relief. It underscored the self-reflexive nature of the field, where researchers were both subjects and observers of the very phenomena they studied. Around the same time, early internet forums, precursors to today's social media, became fertile ground for meme debates. On a Usenet news group called Alt Folklore Urban, users exchanged stories about viral ideas, ranging from the spread of urban legends to the adoption of catchphrases from television shows. In one thread from 1998, a user posted a short, catchy phrase, "The internet is a mirror that reflects our collective imagination." Others responded with variations, adding humor, criticism, or extensions. This microcosm of digital interaction mirrored the very process Dawkins described. A simple informational unit replicated, mutated, and selected for its resonance. The archives of those forums reveal not only the early life of memes, but also the meta-conversations about the legitimacy of memetics as a scientific discipline. Participants debated whether the term meme was a whimsical metaphor or a serious theoretical construct, echoing the larger philosophical tensions that continue to this day. To deepen the philosophical context, we can turn to the work of Pierre Lévi-Strauss, the French structuralist who, decades earlier, sought to uncover the underlying structures of myths, kinship, and language. Lévi-Strauss argued that human cultures share deep, unconscious patterns, what he called structures of the mind, that manifest in myths and rituals. While his approach was rooted in anthropology, his search for universal patterns parallels Dawkins' quest for a universal replicator. Both thinkers in their own ways propose that beneath the surface diversity of cultural artifacts lies a hidden architecture that can be studied scientifically. Levi-Strauss's structuralism, however, emphasizes the role of binary oppositions and the mind's innate capacity to organize experience, whereas Dawkins' meme theory foregrounds the dynamic, iterative process of replication and selection. The dialogue between these perspectives enriches our understanding. Perhaps cultural evolution is best seen as a dance between deep structural constraints and the stochastic, replicative processes that Dawkins highlighted. Richard Rorty's pragmatism, too, offers a complementary lens. Rorty's emphasis on language as a tool rather than a mirror aligns with the view that memes are not static entities but active participants in the ongoing construction of meaning. In a pragmatic framework, the value of a meme is measured not by its fidelity to an original truth, but by its capacity to solve problems, to foster solidarity, or to inspire new forms of expression. This perspective dovetails with contemporary discussions about the role of memes in political discourse. Consider the rise of the OK Boomer meme in the late 2010s, a succinct, sarcastic retort that encapsulated generational tension. Its spread was rapid, its variations numerous, and its impact measurable in the way it shaped online dialogues about age, authority, and cultural change. From a pragmatic standpoint, the meme's success lay in its utility as a linguistic shortcut that conveyed complex attitudes in a single, shareable image. Modern interpretations of memetics have also been enriched by advances in network science and computational modeling. Researchers now employ large-scale data from platforms like Twitter, Reddit, and TikTok to trace the life cycles of memes, quantifying their viral coefficient, measuring mutation rates, and mapping diffusion pathways. These empirical studies lend credence to the notion that cultural artifacts can be subject to evolutionary dynamics akin to those governing genes. Yet, they also reveal the limits of the analogy. Unlike genes, memes can be deliberately engineered, can jump across species barriers from human to algorithmic agents, and can be subject to external forces such as censorship, platform algorithms, and economic incentives. These factors introduce selection pressures that have no direct analog in biological evolution, reinforcing Dennett's caution about overextending the metaphor. The philosophical stakes of memetics extend into the realm of ethics. If ideas are replicators, what moral responsibilities do we bear in shaping the memetic environment? The God Delusion slogan, for instance, was intended to provoke critical thought, but it also sparked backlash, alienation, and in some cases, the entrenchment of defensive religious identities. The cat videos, while largely benign, have raised concerns about animal welfare and the commodification of sentient beings for entertainment. The meme of fake news, which exploded during the 2016 U.S. presidential election, illustrates how replicators can be weaponized, spreading misinformation with profound societal consequences. These examples force us to confront whether the memetic lens merely describes cultural dynamics or also prescribes a normative framework for guiding them. Some philosophers argue that recognizing the replicative nature of ideas empowers us to design interventions, educational curricula, media literacy programs, platform policies that promote healthier meme ecosystems. Others warn that such interventions risk becoming a new form of cultural engineering, echoing historical attempts to control the spread of language or art. Returning to the question of mind-body dualism, the meme theory invites a re-examination of the relationship between mental content and physical substrate. If a meme can exist independently of any single brain, inhabiting a distributed network of minds, then the mind itself may be better understood as a process rather than a thing, a pattern of information flowing through and between neural substrates. This view aligns with contemporary theories in cognitive science that treat consciousness as an emergent property of complex information processing, a stance that resonates with the philosophical position of functionalism. In functionalism, mental states are defined by their causal roles, not by their material composition. The meme, as a pattern that can be instantiated in different media, fits neatly into this schema, suggesting that the mind, like the meme, is a functional pattern that can be realized in various physical forms. Yet the analogy also highlights the limits of functionalist accounts. While a gene's function is tied to the survival and reproduction of the organism, a meme's function is tied to the transmission and retention of information. The two are not isomorphic. A meme can thrive even when it leads to the detriment of its host, a phenomenon that would be maladaptive in a biological sense. This discrepancy raises a profound philosophical question. Does the success of a meme necessarily imply a form of fitness, or does it reveal a different kind of selection pressure, one rooted in attention economics, affective resonance, or social signaling? The answer may lie in a synthesis of Dawkins' original insight with when we first encountered Richard Dawkins. He was most widely known for a single, elegant equation that described how genes could be thought of as selfish replicators, a notion he famously presented in The Selfish Gene in 1976. Yet as the years unfolded, the same mind that had illuminated the mechanisms of natural selection began to turn its gaze toward a different kind of mystery, the mystery of belief itself. By the early 21st century, Dawkins had emerged from the laboratory and entered the public square as a self-described public atheist, a transformation that was both personal and cultural, and that would culminate in the publication of the God Delusion in 2006. In that book, he did not simply argue that God does not exist. He set out a systematic critique of religion, one that would reverberate across continents, provoke fierce debate, and help define what many now call the era of New Atheism. To understand why Dawkins felt compelled to write the God Delusion, we must first trace his intellectual journey. In the late 1990s, while still deeply immersed in evolutionary biology, Dawkins began to notice a pattern. The same evolutionary explanations he used for the diversity of life were being invoked, often with a hint of irony, to explain the origins of religious belief. In a 1999 interview with The Guardian, he remarked that, "The more I understood about the power of natural selection, the more I realized that the same processes that produce the complexity of the eye could also produce the complexity of belief." This insight sparked a shift from the purely scientific to the philosophical, prompting him to ask whether the tools of biology could illuminate the origins of faith, and whether those tools might also reveal the inadequacy of theistic explanations. The core of Dawkins' critique in the God Delusion rests on three interlocking arguments. First, the improbability of design. If the universe were the product of an intelligent creator, that creator would have to possess a mind of extraordinary complexity, and the odds of such a mind arising spontaneously are astronomically low. Second, the argument from improbability, a more formal version of the first, which he frames as a Bayesian calculation. The prior probability of a deity existing is so low that even the most compelling evidence for God fails to raise the posterior probability to any reasonable level. Third, the psychological origins of belief. Dawkins argues that religion is a byproduct of evolutionary adaptations, such as pattern recognition, agency detection, and the tendency to form cohesive groups, rather than a revelation of transcendent truth. When Dawkins writes, the God hypothesis is a scientific hypothesis, and therefore is subject to the same standards of evidence and logic as any other hypothesis, he is inviting us to treat the claim of God's existence not as a matter of faith alone, but as a claim that can be examined with the same rigor we apply to any natural phenomenon. He follows this with a striking analogy. Imagine a child who, after seeing a beautiful painting, declares that the brushstrokes must have been made by an unseen hand. The child's intuition is natural, but the adult, equipped with knowledge of pigments and techniques, recognizes that the painting can be explained without invoking a supernatural painter. In the same way, Dawkins suggests, the awe inspired by the cosmos does not necessitate a divine artist. The first illustrative case that brings these ideas to life is the 2006 debate between Richard Dawkins and the philosopher-theologian William Lane Craig at the University of Oxford. The debate, titled "Is There a God?", was broadcast to a global audience and has since become a touchstone for both supporters and critics of New Atheism. Dawkins opened with a concise statement. "I am a scientist and I am an atheist. I think that the universe can be explained without invoking God, and that belief in God is a delusion." Craig, in contrast, appealed to the cosmological and moral arguments, asserting that the existence of a first cause and an objective moral law point toward a theistic foundation. Throughout the hour-long exchange, Dawkins repeatedly returned to his improbability argument, emphasizing that the sheer number of possible configurations of a universe without a designer dwarfs any conceivable design space. He illustrated this with a thought experiment. Imagine a universe in which the constants of physics were altered by even a fraction of a percent. Stars would not form, chemistry would be impossible, and life would be unimaginable. The odds of those constants aligning by chance, he argued, are not merely low, they are effectively zero. Yet Craig countered by invoking the principle of sufficient reason, suggesting that the existence of the universe itself demands an explanation beyond the brute fact of its existence. The debate concluded without a clear victor, but it crystallized the central tension between a scientific worldview that seeks naturalistic explanations and a theological worldview that posits a transcendent cause. The second case that illustrates Dawkins' impact is the way the God Delusion reshaped the landscape of secular societies in the United Kingdom. In the months following the book's release, the National Secular Society reported a surge in membership, and public opinion polls showed a measurable increase in the number of Britons identifying as non-religious. One particularly telling episode occurred in 2008, when the British Humanist Association organized a series of public lectures titled The Dawkins Effect, featuring speakers who discussed the implications of Dawkins' arguments for education, law, and public policy. A former schoolteacher recounted how a classroom discussion about the improbability of design sparked a lively debate among students, leading many to question the automatic assumption that religious belief was the default position. In a letter to the Times, a university professor wrote, "Dawkins has given a language to doubt that was previously unarticulated. His book has become a catalyst for a broader cultural conversation about the role of religion in public life." The ripple effect extended beyond the UK, influencing secular movements across Europe and prompting religious leaders to respond with renewed vigor. Yet no intellectual movement is without its critics, and Dawkins' arguments have faced rigorous challenges from both moral and philosophical perspectives. One of the most prominent counterarguments comes from C.S. Lewis, the British writer and Christian apologist best known for his Mere Christianity. Lewis famously articulated the moral argument for God, asserting that objective moral values exist and must be grounded in a moral lawgiver. In Mere Christianity, he wrote, "If there is a God, then the universe is a moral universe. If there is no God, then the universe is a moral vacuum." Lewis contended that without a transcendent source, moral obligations would be nothing more than social conventions, lacking any binding authority. He further argued that the very fact that humans feel compelled to act morally points toward a higher moral reality. For Lewis, Dawkins' reliance on evolutionary explanations for morality falls short because it reduces moral sentiment to a byproduct of survival, rather than recognizing it as a reflection of an absolute moral order. A second, more technical critique emerges from the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, whose work on epistemology and the philosophy of religion has become a cornerstone of contemporary theistic defense. Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, presented in his 1993 essay, directly challenges Dawkins' confidence in evolutionary explanations for belief. Plantinga argues that if both naturalism and evolution are true, then our cognitive faculties are aimed at survival rather than truth. Consequently, we have no reason to trust any of our beliefs, including the belief that evolution is true. In his own words, Plantinga asks, if evolution is true, then the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable is low. If they are unreliable, then we have no reason to trust the conclusion that evolution is true. This paradox, Plantinga suggests, undermines Dawkins' scientific confidence because it reveals a potential self-defeating loop. The very mechanism that Dawkins celebrates, natural selection, might not guarantee truth, only adaptive success. Plantinga's critique forces us to reconsider whether the scientific method, as a product of evolutionary processes, can serve as the ultimate arbiter of truth about metaphysical claims. Historical anecdotes provide further texture to the story of Dawkins' public crusade. In 2005, Oxford University hosted a gathering that would later be dubbed the New Atheism Conference, bringing together Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. The event, officially titled The Future of Faith, was intended as a forum for open dialogue, yet it quickly became a flashpoint. As the speakers took the stage, a group of students from the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics staged a peaceful protest, holding signs that read, "Faith is not a delusion." The ensuing exchange was marked by both intellectual vigor and palpable tension. Dawkins, ever the raconteur, later recalled the scene in a post-conference interview. It was as if a scientific symposium had turned into a battlefield of worldviews, each side armed with its own version of truth. The episode exemplified the cultural clash that would define the era, a clash that was not limited to academia but spilled into the media, the streets, and the living rooms of ordinary people. Across the Atlantic, the backlash from religious leaders in the United States was swift and forceful. In the weeks following the release of The God Delusion, prominent evangelical figures such as James Dobson and Pat Robertson issued statements condemning the book as an attack on God and a dangerous weapon aimed at eroding the moral fabric of society. Dobson warned that the spread of atheistic literature will lead to a generation bereft of purpose, drifting into moral relativism. Robertson, in a televised sermon, declared that The God Delusion is not a book. It is a war on the soul. These reactions, while often emotionally charged, also served to amplify the book's visibility, turning it into a cultural touchstone that forced believers and non-believers alike to confront the questions it raised. To fully appreciate Dawkins' place within the broader movement, we must look to his fellow new atheists. Christopher Hitchens, whose razor-sharp prose in God is Not Great echoed many of Dawkins' points, emphasized the historical harms of religion, drawing on the Crusades, the Inquisition, and modern terrorism as evidence of religion's destructive potential. Sam Harris, in The End of Faith, focused on the psychological underpinnings of religious extremism, arguing that faith, when divorced from evidence, becomes a breeding ground for violence. Daniel Dennett, in Breaking the Spell, approached religion as a natural phenomenon to be studied scientifically, much like any other cultural meme. While each author highlighted different facets, Hitchens the historical, Harris the psychological, Dennett the scientific, their works collectively reinforced Dawkins' central claim. That belief in God is not a neutral, benign fact of human experience, but a phenomenon that can be examined, critiqued, and, if necessary, rejected. Yet the conversation does not end with the new atheists. Classical philosophers continue to provide lenses through which we can evaluate Dawkins' arguments. Immanuel Kant, for instance, argued that while we cannot prove God's existence through pure reason, the idea of God serves a practical purpose in the moral realm, providing a posthumous incentive for virtue. Kant wrote in the Critique of Practical Reason, "The idea of God is a necessary postulate of practical reason. Without it, the moral law would be an empty command." From this Kantian perspective, Dawkins' dismissal of the moral argument might be seen as overlooking the pragmatic role that belief plays in moral motivation, even if it cannot be empirically verified. Similarly, Blaise Pascal's famous wager, formulated in the 17th century, offers a different kind of calculus. Pascal suggested that when faced with uncertainty about God's existence, a rational person should bet on God because the potential infinite gain outweighs any finite loss. In Pensées, Pascal wrote, "If you gain everything. If you lose nothing." While Dawkins would likely view Pascal's wager as a pragmatic shortcut that sidesteps the need for evidence, the wager remains a persistent counterpoint in discussions about belief, reminding us that the decision to believe is often entangled with considerations of risk, hope, and existential desire. Returning to Dawkins' own words, we hear him articulate the heart of his argument. "We are all atheists about most of the gods that humanity has ever believed in." He continues, "If we are to be truly scientific, we must be willing to apply the same skeptical scrutiny to our own most cherished beliefs as we do to any other claim." This statement captures the essence of what he calls the delusion, not merely a false belief, but a belief that persists despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, much like a visual illusion that the brain stubbornly interprets even when we know it is illusory. One of the most compelling analogies Dawkins employs to illustrate the argument from improbability is the tornado in a junkyard metaphor. He asks us to imagine a tornado sweeping through a junkyard, assembling a fully functional Boeing 747 from the discarded metal and parts it encounters. The odds of such an event occurring are astronomically low, yet we know that tornadoes do not possess the intentionality to create airplanes. In the same way, the complex order we observe in biological systems could be the product of natural processes that, while not directed, produce intricate structures over vast spans of time. The analogy serves to demystify the intuition that complexity necessarily implies design, urging listeners to consider the power of cumulative, undirected processes. Beyond analogies, Dawkins also draws on concrete scientific examples to bolster his case. He points to the evolution of the eye, a classic illustration of how a seemingly impossible organ can arise through incremental modifications. The simple light-sensitive cells of a flatworm, he explains, can gradually become a pinhole eye, then a lens, each step conferring a selective advantage. The improbability of a fully formed eye appearing spontaneously is thus replaced by a series of plausible natural steps, each one more likely than the improbable leap Dawkins attributes to a designer. This empirical narrative undercuts the argument from design by showing that what once seemed miraculous is, in fact, a natural outcome of evolutionary dynamics. The psychological origins of belief, another pillar of Dawkins' critique, are illuminated through the work of cognitive scientists such as Pascal Boyer and Justin L. Barrett. Dawkins cites research indicating that humans possess a hyperactive agency detection device, a tendency to infer intentional agents behind ambiguous stimuli. This trait, adaptive in ancestral environments where mistaking a rustle for a predator could be life-saving, also predisposes us to see agency in natural phenomena, leading to the attribution of divine agency to thunder, earthquakes, or the starry sky. Dawkins writes, "Our brains are wired to see patterns, to infer purpose, and to belong to a tribe. Religion is the cultural expression of these ancient cognitive biases." By framing belief as an evolutionary byproduct, he challenges the notion that religion is a uniquely human discovery of truth, instead positioning it as an incidental echo of adaptive mechanisms. The impact of the God delusion on secular societies can be observed not only in membership numbers but also in policy debates. In 2009, the UK Parliament held a debate on faith and reason, where several members of Parliament referenced Dawkins' arguments to argue for a more secular education system, free from religious instruction in state schools. One MP quoted Dawkins directly, "The God hypothesis is a scientific hypothesis, and therefore it must be subject to the same standards of evidence as any other hypothesis." This citation illustrates how Dawkins' scientific framing of atheism has entered the lexicon of political discourse, influencing legislative considerations about the role of religion in public institutions. Yet the moral argument for God, as articulated by C.S. Lewis, remains a potent challenge. Lewis's claim that the existence of a moral law implies a moral lawgiver resonates with many who find the idea of objective ethics compelling. He further argues that without God, morality becomes a social construct, susceptible to change and lacking universal binding force. In response, Dawkins counters that moral behavior can be explained through evolutionary game theory, where cooperation and altruism increase group fitness. He points to the prisoner's dilemma and the evolution of reciprocal altruism as evidence that moral instincts can arise without divine command. The debate, therefore, pivots on whether morality requires a transcendent source or can emerge from naturalistic processes, a question that continues to animate philosophical discourse. Plantinga's critique, meanwhile, introduces a meta-philosophical layer. By questioning the reliability of our cognitive faculties under naturalism, Plantinga forces us to confront a potential epistemic crisis. If we cannot trust our reasoning, can we trust any scientific conclusion, including the claim that evolution disproves God? Dawkins acknowledges this challenge but argues that the success of science in predicting phenomena, developing technology, and curing diseases demonstrates that, at least pragmatically, our cognitive faculties are reliable enough to navigate the world. He writes, "Evolution may not guarantee truth, but it does produce beliefs that are generally true enough to survive." This pragmatic defense suggests that while absolute certainty may be unattainable, the track record of scientific inquiry offers a compelling, if provisional, justification for trusting its conclusions. The cultural reverberations of the God delusion also manifest in the arts and media. In 2007, the BBC aired a documentary titled The God Delusion, a debate which juxtaposed Dawkins' arguments with those of theologians, philosophers, and everyday believers. Viewers were invited to consider whether the book's provocative title was a genuine threat to faith or a marketing ploy designed to spark conversation. The documentary's director noted, "We wanted to capture the tension between the certainty of scientific evidence and the lived experience of faith, and see how people negotiate that space." The resulting public discourse highlighted a key insight. For many, belief is not merely an intellectual position, but an integral part of identity, community, and meaning. Dawkins' challenge, therefore, extends beyond the realm of abstract argument into the lived reality of millions. In examining the broader New Atheist movement, it is useful to note the subtle divergences among its leading figures. While Dawkins emphasizes the empirical improbability of design and the evolutionary origins of belief, Hitchens focuses on the historical atrocities committed in the name of religion, arguing that the record of faith is stained with violence and oppression. Harris, on the other hand, concentrates on the neuroscience. When we begin to ask what it means to act morally without invoking a divine command, we step into a terrain that has been charted by philosophers for centuries, yet it is a landscape that Richard Dawkins has helped redraw in the language of science. In his essays, his public talks, and even in the occasional television appearance, Dawkins argues that morality can be understood as a natural phenomenon, rooted in the evolutionary processes that shaped our brains, and that the ultimate yardstick for ethical judgment is the flourishing of conscious creatures, human and non-human alike. To grasp the depth of his claim, we must first trace the origins of secular ethics, meet the thinkers who laid its foundations, and then follow the thread through Dawkins' own contributions, the counter-arguments that challenge them, and the concrete ways his ideas play out in the world today. The story of secular moral philosophy begins, perhaps surprisingly, with a Scottish skeptic named David Hume. In the mid-18th century, Hume wrote, "In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have never observed any argument proceeding in any other way than from the feeling of the sentiment, or from the desire for some sort of pleasure, to the conclusion that it is a moral good." More famously, he formulated what has become known as the is-ought problem. From a statement of fact, we cannot deduce a prescriptive statement of what ought to be. Hume's insight was that the bridge from descriptive claims about the world to normative claims about how we should act is not automatic. It requires a further premise, often a value or a feeling, to make the leap. This gap would later become a central point of contention for anyone proposing a naturalistic basis for ethics. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we encounter the utilitarian philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who proposed that the greatest happiness principle could serve as a universal metric for moral evaluation. Bentham's famous formulation, "the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong," was an early attempt to ground ethics in a measurable secular criterion, the balance of pleasure over pain. Mill refined this by distinguishing higher and lower pleasures, but the core idea remained: moral value could be quantified in terms of human well-being. In the 20th century, the analytic tradition produced figures like G. Moore, who warned against the naturalistic fallacy, the mistaken belief that what is natural is automatically good. Moore argued that moral properties are non-natural, that they cannot be reduced to facts about the world. Yet at the same time, the rise of evolutionary biology offered a new perspective. Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection suggested that cooperation and altruism could emerge not despite, but because of, the pressures of survival. In the 1970s, the biologist W.D. Hamilton introduced the concept of inclusive fitness, showing mathematically how genes that promote helping relatives could spread. These insights laid the groundwork for a scientific account of moral behavior. Enter Richard Dawkins, a geneticist turned public intellectual, whose 1976 book The Selfish Gene introduced the world to the idea that genes are the primary unit of selection, and that organisms, humans included, are survival machines for those genes. While the book sparked controversy for its stark language, it also opened a door. If genes can be selfish, perhaps the altruistic behaviors we cherish are also products of evolutionary pressures, not of divine edicts. Dawkins later elaborated on this in his 2006 book The Delusion, where he wrote, "We are, as a rule, not the masters of our own destiny. We are the product of a long, slow, and often cruel natural selection." He goes on to argue that the same evolutionary forces that sculpted our capacity for empathy also give us the tools to construct moral systems that extend beyond kinship, to strangers, and even to other species. One of Dawkins' most influential contributions to secular ethics is the moral landscape metaphor, a concept he first articulated in a 2007 article for The Times and later expanded in a 2010 book titled The Delusion and a separate work, The Moral Landscape: How Science Can Determine Human Values. He invites us to picture morality as a topographical map, with peaks representing states of maximum well-being for conscious creatures and valleys representing suffering. In this analogy, the moral task is akin to navigating a landscape. We must find routes that ascend toward the peaks, avoid the valleys, and when possible, raise the overall elevation of the terrain. The crucial claim is that science, by uncovering the causes of happiness and suffering, can guide us toward those higher ground. In Dawkins' own words, the moral landscape is a map of the relationship between well-being and the physical facts of the world. This is a bold departure from the idea that morality is a matter of divine command or of inscrutable intuition. It suggests that empirical knowledge about health, psychology, and sociology can inform ethical decisions. To understand how this plays out in concrete terms, let us examine two of Dawkins' most frequently cited positions: his commentary on animal rights and his stance on bioethics, particularly human cloning. In a 2009 essay for The Guardian titled The Delusion, a short and sweet version, Dawkins writes, "If we are to be consistent, the fact that other animals are capable of feeling pain forces us to extend our moral concern beyond the human species." He argues that because the capacity for suffering is a biological fact shared across many species, our moral obligations should extend accordingly. This is not a sentimental appeal, but a logical extension of the moral landscape. The peaks of well-being include the reduction of unnecessary pain for all sentient beings, not merely for humans. Dawkins' position resonates with Peter Singer's utilitarian argument in Animal Liberation, where Singer famously declares, "The question is not, can they reason, but can they suffer?" Yet Dawkins distinguishes himself by rooting the claim in evolutionary continuity. The same neural mechanisms that produce empathy in humans are present, to varying degrees, in other mammals, making it scientifically plausible that they experience suffering. When it comes to cloning, Dawkins has been equally forthright. In a 2005 interview with The Times after the announcement of the first successful cloning of a human embryo, he remarked, the ability to clone a human being does not, in itself, raise a moral problem. The problem arises when we consider the welfare of the cloned individual. He emphasizes that the moral calculus should focus on the likely outcomes for the cloned person, potential health complications, identity issues, social stigma, rather than on an abstract opposition to playing God. This perspective reflects the moral landscape's emphasis on well-being. If cloning is likely to produce suffering, it should be discouraged. If it can be performed safely and enhance human flourishing, it could be morally permissible. Dawkins thus sidesteps the theological language that often dominates bioethical debates and instead asks a pragmatic question. Will this improve or diminish the quality of life for those involved? The appeal to human well-being as a grounding for ethics is not without its critics. The first major objection comes from the is-ought gap that Hume identified. Critics argue that even if we can map the consequences of actions in terms of pleasure and pain, we have not shown why we ought to prioritize those consequences. Hume would ask, why should we care about the happiness of conscious beings? Why not value something else like justice, autonomy, or divine order? Dawkins responds by invoking a kind of naturalistic pragmatism. The very capacity to experience pleasure and pain is what makes us moral agents in the first place. If we deny the relevance of well-being, we undermine the basis of empathy, which is the engine of moral motivation. He writes, our moral intuitions are themselves the product of evolution. They evolved because they promoted the survival and reproduction of groups that cared for each other. In this view, the bridge from is to ought is built upon the fact that our moral sentiments are themselves evolved and thus have a natural justification. A second, more subtle challenge is the accusation of moral relativism. If moral judgments are derived from empirical facts about well-being, does that mean that cultures with different conceptions of happiness can claim equally valid moral systems? Critics such as Michael Sandel argue that reducing morality to a calculus of well-being strips away the richness of moral imagination, the sense of the good life that is rooted in traditions, narratives, and communal values. In his 1998 book Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, Sandel writes, the moral imagination is not a neutral instrument, it is shaped by the stories we tell about ourselves. From this perspective, Dawkins' approach could be seen as imposing a monolithic, perhaps Western, definition of well-being onto a pluralistic world. Dawkins anticipates this critique by emphasizing that the moral landscape is not a single, static map, but a dynamic, evidence-based model that can accommodate diverse conceptions of flourishing, provided they are grounded in measurable outcomes. He suggests that cross-cultural dialogue can enrich the map, identifying new peaks of well-being that were previously invisible. Peter Singer, while generally sympathetic to the scientific grounding of ethics, offers a nuanced counterpoint. Singer's utilitarian framework aligns with the moral landscape's focus on reducing suffering, but he pushes further by advocating for the equal consideration of interests across species, a principle Dawkins seems to accept but does not always foreground. In a 2009 debate with the philosopher William Lane Craig, Singer argued, if we accept that the capacity to suffer is the basis for moral concern, then we must also accept that the same principle applies to all sentient beings, irrespective of their species. Dawkins, in a 2010 interview with The Atlantic, agreed that the moral relevance of animal suffering is undeniable, but he warned against an uncritical extension that might, for instance, justify the sacrifice of human well-being for the sake of animal interests. The tension between universal compassion and the practicalities of human flourishing illustrates the delicate balancing act that secular ethicists must perform. The third line of criticism comes from deontological philosophers who argue that moral duties cannot be reduced to outcomes. Immanuel Kant, though a theist, famously held that actions are morally right if they are done from duty, according to a universalizable maxim, regardless of consequences. Contemporary Kantian scholars such as Christine Korsgaard maintain that respect for persons as ends in themselves provides a moral foundation that is not contingent on empirical data about happiness. From this angle, Dawkins' reliance on well-being could be seen as neglecting the intrinsic value of autonomy and dignity. Dawkins counters by pointing out that autonomy itself is a contributor to well-being. When people are free to pursue their own goals, they tend to experience higher levels of life satisfaction. Thus, respecting autonomy is not a separate moral principle, but a component of the broader landscape of flourishing. To see how these debates translate into real-world policy, consider the case of animal welfare legislation in the United Kingdom. In 2006, the UK Parliament passed the Animal Welfare Act, which enshrined the principle that the welfare of animals, is a matter of public concern. The Act's language reflects a Dawkins-inspired moral landscape. It requires that the needs of animals, such as the need to express normal behavior and avoid pain, be met. The legislation was heavily influenced by the scientific community's research on animal cognition and pain perception, echoing Dawkins' claim that empirical knowledge can shape moral law. Yet critics, including some religious groups, argued that the law went too far, imposing a humanist ethic on agricultural practices. The ensuing public debate highlighted the tension between a science-based moral framework and traditional cultural values. A second example is the global conversation about human cloning and gene editing. After the advent of CRISPR-Cas9 technology, the International Summit on Human Gene Editing in 2015 brought together scientists, ethicists, and policymakers. Dawkins was not a formal participant, but his writings were frequently cited in the summit's background documents. The central ethical question, whether we should edit the human germline to eliminate disease, was framed in terms of the moral landscape. Would such interventions raise the overall well-being of future generations, or would they introduce new forms of suffering? The consensus, echoing Dawkins' pragmatic stance, was that a cautious, evidence-based approach was required, with rigorous assessment of potential harms. The summit's recommendations, moratoriums, public engagement, and transparent risk assessments, demonstrate how a secular, science-oriented ethic can inform policy without invoking divine authority. Beyond policy, Dawkins' ideas have seeped into popular culture, perhaps most memorably during his 2009 appearance on The Colbert Report. In that episode, Stephen Colbert, playing his satirical pundit persona, asked Dawkins to define secular morality. Dawkins replied, "It's the idea that we can decide what's right and wrong based on the consequences for human and animal well-being, not because a deity tells us to." The segment went viral, and the phrase secular morality entered the public lexicon. This moment illustrates how Dawkins has helped translate complex philosophical arguments into accessible sound bites, making the case that moral reasoning does not require a supernatural premise. Dawkins' involvement in the Humanist Manifesto of 2003 further cements his role as a public advocate for a secular moral framework. The manifesto, signed by over 600 humanists worldwide, declares that humanism is a progressive, non-religious life stance that emphasizes reason, compassion, and the pursuit of human fulfillment. In the preface, Dawkins wrote, "We have the responsibility, as a species, to use our intelligence to create a better world for ourselves and for future generations." This statement encapsulates his moral landscape. The responsibility to climb toward higher peaks of well-being, guided by reason and evidence. To deepen our understanding, let us draw an analogy from engineering. Imagine a city planner tasked with designing a transportation network. The planner must consider traffic flow, safety, cost, and environmental impact. Each of these variables can be measured, modeled, and optimized. In a similar way, the moral landscape invites us to treat ethical decision-making as a kind of engineering problem. We identify the variables that affect well-being, health, education, freedom, social connection, and we design policies that maximize positive outcomes while minimizing harm. Just as a city planner uses data and simulations, a secular ethicist uses scientific studies, statistical analyses, and interdisciplinary research to map the terrain. This analogy helps demystify the idea that morality can be systematic rather than mystical. Yet we must also recognize the limits of the engineering metaphor. Engineering assumes a set of agreed-upon goals. Moral philosophy must grapple with the very definition of those goals. What counts as well-being is contested. Some argue that happiness alone is insufficient. Others claim that meaning, autonomy, or dignity are equally essential. Dawkins acknowledges this complexity, stating, "The moral landscape is not a single line. It is a multidimensional space where various aspects of flourishing intersect." He invites us to think of morality as a multidimensional optimization problem, where trade-offs are inevitable, and where the best solutions are those that respect the full spectrum of human experience. Returning to the historical anecdotes, we should recall that Dawkins' early career was shaped by the intellectual climate of the 1970s. A period when the debate over evolution versus creationism was reaching a fever pitch in the United Kingdom and the United States. In a 1978 interview with The New Scientist, a young Dawkins recounted how his mentor, the ethologist Nicolaas Timbergen, urged him to look at behavior not as a moral judgment but as a problem of adaptation. This scientific humility, seeing behavior first as a biological fact before assigning moral weight, became a cornerstone of Dawkins' later moral philosophy. It also mirrors the broader shift from a theological to a naturalistic worldview that characterized the late 20th century. Another anecdote worth recalling is the 1995 conference at the Royal Society titled Science and Society, where Dawkins shared the stage with philosophers like Mary Midgley, who famously critiqued the selfish gene metaphor as a reductionist narrative that could be misused to justify social Darwinism. Midgley warned, "We must be careful not to let the language of biology become a moral doctrine." Dawkins responded by clarifying that the metaphor was descriptive, not prescriptive, and that the moral landscape was an attempt to prevent exactly such misinterpretations. He argued that understanding the biological roots of altruism does not excuse selfishness. Rather, it reveals the pathways through which cooperation evolved, and thus how we might nurture those pathways deliberately. This exchange exemplifies the productive tension between scientific description and moral prescription that defines Dawkins' approach. Cross-referencing Dawkins with other contemporary secular moral thinkers enriches the picture. Sam Harris, in his 2010 book The Moral Landscape, explicitly builds on Dawkins' ideas, arguing that science can answer moral questions because there are objectively better and worse ways for conscious creatures to live. Harris writes, "If we can answer the question, what is good for us? Then we have answered the question, what when we turn our attention to the controversies that have surrounded Richard Dawkins over the past 2 decades. We are confronted not merely with a series of public spats, but with a deeper philosophical clash, a clash between a vision of science as the ultimate arbiter of truth and a set of concerns about the limits of that vision." To understand this clash, we must first recall the context in which Dawkins emerged as a public intellectual. In the early 1990s, his book The Selfish Gene introduced a gene-centered view of evolution that reshaped biology, and his later work, The God Delusion, thrust him into the arena of religious criticism. From that moment onward, Dawkins was no longer just a scientist. He became a symbol of a certain kind of rationalist, secular optimism. The controversies that followed, accusations of scientific reductionism, charges of Islamophobia, and debates over his stance on free speech, are therefore inseparable from the philosophical questions he raised about the role of science in public life. One of the most persistent criticisms leveled against Dawkins is that he practices what philosophers call scientific reductionism. The idea that all complex phenomena can ultimately be explained in terms of elementary physical processes. In The God Delusion, he writes, "Science is the great antidote to the poison of superstition," a sentence that on its face celebrates the power of empirical inquiry. Yet critics such as Thomas Nagel have argued that this very confidence blinds us to the richness of human experience that may lie beyond the reach of current scientific methodology. Nagel, in his essay The View from Nowhere, asks whether a purely objective standpoint can ever capture the subjective qualities of consciousness, love, or moral judgment. If we accept Dawkins' claim that science alone can answer all meaningful questions, we risk marginalizing entire domains of philosophical inquiry, ethics, aesthetics, the meaning of life, domains that do not submit readily to experimental verification. To illustrate how this reductionist stance has played out in public controversies, let us examine the 2013 debate that pitted Dawkins against the Islamic scholar Tariq Ramadan in the so-called Dawkins versus Islam encounter. The debate, organized by the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, was billed as a meeting of science and faith. Dawkins opened with his characteristic assertion that the universe is indifferent to our existence, and he proceeded to argue that religious belief, particularly in the form of Islamic fundamentalism, was a threat to rational discourse. Ramadan, for his part, responded by emphasizing the distinction between faith as a personal, existential commitment and the political misuse of religion. The exchange quickly descended into a clash of rhetorical styles. Dawkins employed the language of evolutionary biology and probability, while Ramadan invoked the lived experience of Muslim communities and the historical context of colonialism. Observers noted that Dawkins' approach, while intellectually rigorous, often appeared to treat Islam as a monolith, ignoring the internal diversity and theological nuance within the tradition. Critics seized upon this moment, arguing that Dawkins had once again reduced a complex cultural phenomenon to a single explanatory variable, namely, the presence of religious belief. The debate's aftermath was telling. A number of Muslim scholars and activists wrote open letters accusing Dawkins of Islamophobia, a term that had entered the public lexicon to denote prejudice against Islam as a religion and against Muslims as a group. In a 2014 article for The Guardian, Rebecca Goldstein, a philosopher of science, wrote, "When the critique of religion becomes a blanket condemnation of a whole civilization, the moral ground of the argument erodes." Goldstein's point was not that Dawkins' arguments about the logical inconsistencies of religious claims were invalid, but that the style in which he presented them, often with sweeping generalizations, risked alienating the very audiences he hoped to persuade. The controversy, therefore, was not merely about factual disagreements, but about the ethics of public discourse. How should a scientist speak about faith without slipping into prejudice? A second distinct controversy emerged in 2015, when a petition was circulated to block Dawkins from speaking at the University of Cambridge's annual Science and Society lecture series. The petition, signed by over 1,000 students and faculty members, cited concerns that Dawkins' presence would create a hostile environment for religious students and would undermine the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion. The petition's authors quoted a passage from Dawkins' The God Delusion in which he described religion as a man-made virus. They argued that such language, when spoken in a prestigious academic setting, could be construed as harassment. In response, the university's administration defended the principle of academic freedom, stating that the free exchange of ideas, even those that are uncomfortable, is essential to the mission of higher education. The episode sparked a broader debate about the limits of free speech on campus, echoing earlier controversies surrounding speakers like Milo Yiannopoulos and Jordan Peterson. Defenders of Dawkins, such as Sam Harris and A.C. Grayling, offered a different perspective on these incidents. Harris, in his 2015 book Waking Up, praised Dawkins for holding a mirror up to the irrationalities that dominate our public discourse, and he argued that the backlash against Dawkins was itself a symptom of a cultural climate that privileges identity politics over intellectual rigor. Grayling, in a 2016 essay for the Times Literary Supplement, contended that the moment we begin to police language on the basis of perceived offense, we surrender the very tools that allow us to critique power. Both Harris and Grayling emphasized the importance of protecting the right to challenge religious ideas, even when such challenges are uncomfortable. They suggested that the real threat to open discourse is not the presence of a critical voice like Dawkins, but the silencing of that voice through institutional pressure. Conversely, critics of Dawkins have also offered nuanced reflections that go beyond simple accusations of bigotry. Christopher Hitchens, who had been a longtime ally of Dawkins in the New Atheist movement, later expressed a more measured view. In a 2017 interview with The New Yorker, Hitchens said, "I admire Richard's intellect, but I have sometimes wondered whether his relentless focus on debunking belief blinds him to the possibility that belief can also be a source of meaning and moral motivation." Hitchens' reflection hints at a tension that has haunted the New Atheist project from its inception. The balance between exposing falsehoods and acknowledging the human need for narratives that give life purpose. Rebecca Goldstein, meanwhile, has argued that Dawkins' style of argumentation often neglects the phenomenological dimension of religious experience. In her 2018 book, The Philosophy of the Self, she writes, "When we reduce belief to a set of neurochemical processes, we risk losing sight of the lived reality of those who find comfort, community, and ethical guidance in those beliefs." Goldstein's critique, therefore, does not deny the existence of cognitive biases or evolutionary explanations for religion. Rather, it calls for a more empathetic, interdisciplinary approach that respects both scientific insight and human subjectivity. The historical anecdotes that surround Dawkins help us see how these debates have unfolded over time. In 2008, at the Oxford Union, Dawkins faced a formidable opponent in the form of the philosopher Alistair McGrath, a theologian and former Anglican priest. The debate, titled "Is Religion a Force for Good?", became a landmark moment in the public visibility of the New Atheist movement. Dawkins, employing his characteristic blend of humor and scientific argumentation, declared, "If you are a religious believer, you are, by definition, a liar." McGrath countered by invoking the moral teachings of Christianity and the historical contributions of religious institutions to education and charity. The audience, split almost evenly, voted in favor of Dawkins, but the aftermath revealed a deeper undercurrent. While many applauded Dawkins' boldness, others felt that his rhetorical excesses had alienated potential allies. The Oxford Union debate thus serves as a microcosm of the larger controversy, an illustration of how style and substance intertwine in the public philosophy of science. Another pivotal moment in Dawkins' public life came with the formation of the Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science in 2006, later renamed the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. The Foundation's mission was to promote scientific literacy, secularism, and critical thinking. Its early projects included funding for science education in schools, supporting secular charities, and publishing a series of Science and Reason podcasts. Yet the foundation also attracted criticism for its perceived alignment with an aggressive anti-religious agenda. In 2012, a group of secular humanists wrote an open letter to the foundation, urging it to reconsider the tone of its outreach, lest we trade one dogma for another. The foundation responded by emphasizing its commitment to evidence-based discourse and by highlighting its collaborations with diverse scientific organizations. This anecdote underscores a recurring theme: the tension between advocacy and inclusivity, between the desire to champion rationalism and the risk of appearing intolerant. When we examine the philosophical impact of Dawkins, we must ask, what does it mean for a scientist to become a philosopher? Traditionally, the philosophy of science has been the domain of thinkers like Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, and Imre Lakatos, who examined the methodological underpinnings of scientific practice. Dawkins, however, bypassed the academic corridors of philosophy and went straight to the public sphere, using popular books, television appearances, and social media to disseminate his ideas. In doing so, he challenged the conventional separation between hard science and soft philosophy. Some scholars, such as Michael J. Sandel, have warned that this blurring can lead to what they call scientism, the belief that science is not only the best method for answering empirical questions, but also the only legitimate way to address normative and existential concerns. Sandel, in his 2010 lecture, The Case Against Perfection, argued that when we let science dictate the shape of our values, we risk losing the democratic deliberation that makes a pluralistic society possible. Dawkins' critics see his public pronouncements on morality, particularly his assertion that morality is a product of evolution, not divine command, as an example of this scientific overreach. Yet there are defenders who argue that Dawkins is simply extending the naturalistic worldview that has been a hallmark of the Enlightenment. They point to the work of philosophers such as Daniel Dennett, who has collaborated with Dawkins and shares his confidence in the explanatory power of evolutionary theory. Dennett, in Breaking the Spell, writes, "If we can explain the origins of belief in naturalistic terms, we can also begin to understand how those beliefs shape our moral intuitions." In this sense, Dawkins is part of a broader intellectual tradition that seeks to ground ethics in human nature rather than in transcendent authority. Neil deGrasse Tyson, a contemporary science communicator, often echoes this sentiment when he says, "Science is a way of thinking, not a body of knowledge," suggesting that the methodological virtues of skepticism and evidence-based reasoning can be applied to many domains of human life, including ethics. The question of free speech is perhaps the most concrete arena where Dawkins' legacy is being contested today. The 2015 Cambridge petition, the 2018 No Platform movement at several UK universities, and the more recent 2022 controversy surrounding his invitation to speak at the University of Texas all reveal a pattern. Institutions are grappling with whether to protect the right of a controversial figure to speak or to shield their communities from what they perceive as harmful rhetoric. Proponents of unrestricted speech, such as A.C. Grayling, argue that the marketplace of ideas functions only when all voices, even the most disagreeable, are allowed to be heard. Critics, on the other hand, maintain that speech can cause real harm, especially when it reinforces stereotypes or contributes to social marginalization. In a 2020 essay, Rebecca Goldstein wrote, "Free speech is not an abstract principle. It is a lived reality that can either empower or oppress, depending on the context in which it is exercised." The debate thus forces us to confront a central philosophical dilemma. How do we balance the value of open inquiry with the responsibility to protect vulnerable populations from hate speech? Dawkins' own statements, such as his 2014 tweet that the only thing that separates us from the animals is the ability to think and to speak our mind, are invoked on both sides of the argument, illustrating how a single phrase can be read as a celebration of liberty or as a provocation. In assessing Dawkins' influence on the philosophy of science, we must also consider how his ideas have been incorporated into academic curricula. Courses on evolution, for instance, often include a module on memetics, a term coined by Dawkins in The Selfish Gene to describe how cultural ideas replicate analogously to genes. While the concept has been critiqued by scholars like Susan Blackmore, who argues that memetics lacks a rigorous empirical basis, it nonetheless sparked interdisciplinary dialogue between biology, anthropology, and philosophy. Moreover, the very notion of the gene's eye view has prompted philosophers such as Peter Godfrey Smith to explore the metaphysical implications of viewing organisms as vehicles for gene propagation. In his 2016 book Other Minds, Godfrey Smith reflects, Dawkins' gene-centric narrative invites us to reconsider agency, not as a property of whole organisms, but as an emergent phenomenon rooted in the competition and cooperation of replicators. This line of thought has opened new avenues for philosophical inquiry into the nature of self, consciousness, and identity. The contemporary relevance of Dawkins' ideas can also be seen in the ongoing debates about artificial intelligence and the future of humanity. In a 2021 interview with The Atlantic, Dawkins speculated that if we ever create machines that can replicate themselves, we will be dealing with a new kind of replicator, one that operates on silicon rather than carbon. This speculation echoes his earlier mimetic theory, extending it into the realm of digital culture. Philosophers of technology such as Nick Bostrom have taken up this line of reasoning, warning of the control problem associated with superintelligent AI. The dialogue between Dawkins' evolutionary perspective and Bostrom's existential risk framework illustrates how Dawkins' legacy continues to shape interdisciplinary conversations, bridging biology, philosophy, and ethics. It is also worth noting how Dawkins' public persona has influenced the broader landscape of public intellectualism. In the age of social media, the model of the celebrity scientist who writes best-selling books and appears on talk shows has become commonplace. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, and even astrophysicist Carlo Rovelli have adopted a style that blends scientific explanation with personal storytelling, an approach that Dawkins helped popularize. Yet, as Michael Sandel warns, the elevation of charismatic scientists to moral arbiters can create a vacuum where philosophical nuance is supplanted by charismatic authority. Sandel's critique is not merely about the individuals involved, but about the structural dynamics of a media environment that rewards simplicity and sensationalism over complexity. When we compare Dawkins to earlier figures who attempted to reconcile science and philosophy, think of the Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume, who famously argued that miracles are violations of natural law, or the logical positivists who sought to eliminate metaphysics altogether. We see both continuity and rupture. Like Hume, Dawkins employs probabilistic reasoning to challenge religious claims. Like the logical positivists, he often dismisses metaphysical statements as meaningless when they cannot be empirically verified. Yet Dawkins departs from these predecessors in his use of evolutionary biology as a comprehensive explanatory framework for human culture, extending the scope of scientific reductionism far beyond what Hume or the Vienna Circle ever imagined. This expansion has provoked new criticisms, particularly from philosophers like Thomas Nagel, who argue that the very act of reducing consciousness to neuronal firings may be an explanatory dead end, because it leaves untouched the qualitative aspect of experience. Dawkins' confidence in the explanatory reach of science thus invites a renewed dialogue between the natural sciences and the humanities, a dialogue that remains unfinished. Returning to the case studies, the 2013 debate with Tariq Ramadan provides a vivid illustration of how Dawkins' arguments can be both compelling and polarizing. During the debate, Dawkins invoked the concept of cognitive bias, citing the work of Daniel Kahneman on the availability heuristic to suggest that religious believers overestimate the prevalence of divine intervention because such ideas are readily recalled from cultural narratives. Ramadan responded by pointing out that the same cognitive mechanisms that produce bias also enable humans to create art, music, and moral systems, activities that are not reducible to mere survival strategies. He quoted the Persian poet Rumi, "The wound is the place where the light enters you," emphasizing that suffering and spirituality can coexist with rational thought. The audience's reaction was mixed. Some applauded Dawkins' clear articulation of scientific principles, while others felt that his tone dismissed the emotional dimensions of faith. The debate's transcript, later published in The New Humanist, includes a moment where Dawkins says, "If you cannot accept that the universe does not have a purpose, then you are choosing a story over evidence." Ramadan's reply, "Stories are not lies. They are the scaffolding upon which we build meaning," has been quoted in numerous academic papers as a succinct encapsulation of the tension between empirical evidence and existential narrative. The 2015 Cambridge petition, meanwhile, highlights how institutional contexts can amplify or mitigate controversy. The petition's authors argued that the presence of a speaker who repeatedly characterizes religion as a virus creates a hostile learning environment for students of faith. In response, the university's vice-chancellor released a statement asserting that the university is a place for debate, not for the suppression of dissenting views. The episode sparked a series of op-eds in The Times, The Guardian, and The Independent, each presenting a different angle on the free speech dilemma. Sam Harris, writing for The Spectator, defended Dawkins by stating, "If we begin to censor speakers because they challenge religious orthodoxy, we betray the very principle of intellectual freedom that underpins academia." Conversely, Rebecca Goldstein, in a piece for the New Republic, warned that the line between robust critique and vilification is thin, and when a speaker repeatedly employs dehumanizing metaphors, the risk of